My favorite thought leaders, or so-called experts, are those who have done it in a big way. Then they sit down with us to tell us how they did it, versus those who have only studied it and talked about it, and really, that's all they've done. Well, I have a great treat for you today. Our friend John Addison has done it in a big way, and he did it with his co-CEO, Rick Williams, for over a decade and a half, captaining a multi-billion-dollar financial powerhouse through both calm and sunny times and through some crazy, rough, and stormy times, maintaining extraordinary success all along the way. He's learned a lot about leadership over the years, and we're going to get him to share the benefit of that experience with us here. Be ready to take lots of notes. John's got some hard-won wisdom to report from his incredible journey as a leader. John, welcome to Success. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Darren. Great to be with you today, my friend.
So let's start off with an easy question that will help us get to know you a little bit better. Describe yourself as a leader.
You know, Darren, I think of myself as just a normal guy who reacted to abnormal circumstances, but I'm a fighter. I love my team. I love what I stand for. I love our business, and I was a fighter. And so if I were defining myself in kind of a few words, I'd say, number one, I think I'm consistent. I don't think if you talk to people who dealt with John Addison, you'd have a lot of people who would say, you know, oh, this day he's that way, that day he's another way. I tend to be consistent. And I've always believed that the job of a leader is to create the environment, create an environment of success, to create the atmosphere for other people to perform. Too often, I think leaders become where they think, well, now I'm on top. It's all about me. Well, no, as the leader, that means, in my opinion, you've got to be more of a servant. You got to be more of a steward of the business. And the biggest way you lead is not through fancy words or great speeches or cute ideas. The way you lead is through setting the tone, setting the pace, and having other people see that no one is going to outwork you, that no one's going to love it more, that if someone needs to sacrifice, you're at the front of the line, in the sacrifice line. If there's credit to be given out, you're at the rear of the credit line, and that you are the person who recognizes that the team, not you, big team, little me, that the team is your responsibility.
Now, like you, John, I believe that leadership is an awesome responsibility. It's a great privilege. It's also a great honor. Talk about the moment when you realized that, oh, you're actually in that position of being the leader. When did it happen? And how did that realization sort of transform you as a person in that moment, knowing that other people were looking to you for leadership?
You know, let me give two illustrations of it. One is as a child. I was an only child that grew up out in the country with amazing parents. I had a very blessed childhood. But, you know, I think many of us are born with inclinations. You're not born with skills, but you are born with, in your DNA, inclinations. And, you know, playing games as a kid, you know, whether it was playing Army, playing Cowboys, doing whatever, if we, you know, all of my friends over or whatever for the weekend, spend the night. My dad built me a big giant tree house out in our kind of pasture and stuff. I was always the one that was organizing things. I was always the one that said, oh, now let's play this. Now let's play that. So as I look back at my childhood, I think I had some inclinations of where I never wanted to be the shrinking violet in the corner. I always wanted to be the person that was sort of setting the tone for things. I think as a business, in the business realm, it really was in the early 1990s. The founder of our company, Art Williams, had sold the business and was no longer with the business. And we had a lot of leaders coming in from New York who had tons of different ideas for all of us, kind of ignorant Southerners, that they were going to do this, do that, do another thing, do it this way this time. And in truth, over time, they realized that this was a different type business than they were used to. We had a big convention that was going to be, well, it was supposed to be a big convention, but it was looking like a disaster convention that was going to be in Fort Worth, Texas in 1992. And Art had always run the big events, the conventions and stuff. Those things had flown from the brain and the soul of Art Williams. And now really things were rudderless. It was kind of floundering. And I was a vice president of an area in the company, a department, but I was in some of the meetings and I realized no one was taking charge of this. So I did. And I wound up saying, no, don't do this. Let's do that. Let's take this approach. And I was amazed that people sort of went, okay, that sounds good to me. And we wound up working, I was working with a dear friend of mine who was the CEO at that time, Pete Dawkins. And we wound up having a successful convention. It certainly wasn't lights out of the park home run, but it really was kind of a landmark where the company went, okay, we've made it through this awful transition. And I realized in that process quite often, you've got to be the leader before you have the title. And out of that, what wound up happening is I wound up running all of those areas and running the events and stuff like that. But it was a time where I saw a vacuum and I stepped up to fill it.
So really, the lesson there is that a leader is anyone who decides to step up. You don't have to have the title on your badge yet. It's anybody in the moment that decides to step up, then you take the position of leader. So then in all the time that you were co-CEO of Primerica, what do you think was the most poignant feedback, whether it be positive or negative, that you ever got about yourself?
Well, if you say poignant, my tendency is to always think of the positive. In truth, one of my strengths or weaknesses in life is I tend to remember the positive and forget the negative. So I think that's a good self-defense mechanism for a leader. But, it goes to that time, 2009, when really it was an existential war. City was wrestling with cataclysmic consequences. They were tarped. The world was collapsing. And here Rick and I were trying to get our very profitable, good company out of City. And we knew we were in an existential fight and that everything was riding on us. And we did a good job of trying to, one of the things I've learned is it's no need to just share negative news with people until you know it's negative. And so we're wrestling with so much of this and keeping it to ourselves. But our leaders knew to some extent what we were dealing with. There was one gentleman named Dee Pinkard, who's from Tennessee. He's a senior national sales director, great guy in our company. Just out of the blue, and it seemed like it was always right when we were at one of our toughest moments, he would call Dana, my executive assistant. She'd call me and say, Dee's on the phone. You want to talk to him? I'd say, sure. She'd put him through, and he'd say, look, something's on my heart this morning, and I know you need prayer. And he would just pray for me on the phone, sweetest prayer you would ever hear. And then I would just thank him or whatever. A lot of times get emotional. And one of the things I told my wife is if I ever get really, really sick, I want her to call Dee because somehow he has a line into something because he knew every time. Second illustration from that is, at that time, the big banks were all tarped and they had to cancel all of their trips and stuff because Wells Fargo got so clocked in the news for having their mortgage brokers at an event. And so it was all, they're taking your tax money and spending it on boondoggles. We had to cancel an incentive trip that our part-timers, these were not boondoggles, but we were going to take almost 2,000 couples to the Atlantis, and we were forced to cancel it. It led to a real confrontation between us and the management at City, and I had to tell our sales force. So the first thing I did was have our senior leaders on the phone. And I think for many of them, that was the moment they knew, oh, Lord, this is huge. John and Rick really are at war. And one of the great leaders, Bill Whittle, who is just a special and wonderful human being, when I finished talking, he said, John, we got your back. We know what you're doing. And he gave this talk. I still get emotional thinking about it, where I just realized that these guys loved me and we were a family and we were a team and we were in it together. So those are kind of two really poignant examples.
Mm-hmm. So not looking at the negative here, but being reflective and then the positive improvement that came out of this. Share the hardest lesson you ever learned as the CEO. One time when you really had to humble yourself, let's say, and make some personal changes.
When you're in the middle of a battle, quite often you can get a view that everything sort of centers around you and stuff. And so it goes to that same time. It was when we were told we had to cancel the trip. And Rick and I, we had almost had a deal done in '08, right before the world collapsed. And then, anyone that remembers, and unfortunately I remember it all too vividly, when the world collapsed, no deals were happening. There was no financing. Credit markets were completely dried up in the country. And Citi was negotiating with Rick and I for an extended contract where, in essence, what it would do is it would have paid us a lot of money after 5 years, even if the company was never sold. But then if the company got sold, it would have paid us a large sum of money each when the deal was done. And what it was to retain us. It was called a retention agreement, so that we would agree to stay and run the business during this catastrophe that was going on. So we were negotiating with them and working with them. Now, that deal would have had very significant non-compete clauses in it for Rick and I, and really would have tied us up. In essence, Darren, it would have taken away a lot of our leverage on things, but it would have kept the deal going together. So we're in a meeting and we're told they're canceling the event, and I have a very negative reaction, and that is a minor thing, and get up and tell them basically to stuff the whole thing and leave. I'm on the street on Park Avenue waving down a cab back to the airport. I'm on the phone with Dana, my executive assistant, telling her that, I'm heading back. This whole thing's over. She's very emotional on the phone. Rick runs up to me with his cell phone and just says, "Here," and sticks it in my ear. And he had Art Williams on, and Art was very emotional. And he said, "John, I understand how proud you are and how much pride you have and how you want to, more than life itself, just blow it up right now and go on and do something. But you gotta go back in. You need to go back in and apologize to them." It was very funny. He said, "You got to go back in." And he said, "I've had to do it a bunch of times, and you know how proud I am. You got to go back and apologize to them, and you got to stay in the game, and you got to save our people." And we went back inside. I told them, "Look, guys, you've told us that we can't run our company. Not having events means not running our company. And I'm here to tell you, I apologize for that, but I'm not signing a contract with you. If you want to do a deal, if you want to help us get the company out of Citi, then I'm here. But I'm not signing something that takes away our leverage." And that horribly negative moment, and trust me, it's easy now to look back and tell the story of it, but at the moment it was a disaster. We were dealing with, existential forces here. That moment, though, was the turning point where from then on we had the momentum that wound up getting the company free and creating the successful IPO that we had, which, by the way, was successful for both Primerica and for Citigroup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a pretty extraordinary time on the planet. Yeah.
Yep.
So I believe, John, that people can learn from both example as well as warning, and also be able to look at you who have had these extraordinary achievements as a leader, as I mentioned in the introduction, and say, "Oh, well, he also has a strength that I share, or also has a weakness that I think I have as well." What do you think are your biggest strengths as a leader that has allowed you to do some of these extraordinary things? And then what do you also think is your biggest weakness as a leader?
I would imagine my wife could do a much better job on the weaknesses, and particularly my wife and Rick Williams, my partner, could do a much better job there. But I'll take a shot at both of them. I think on the strength side, I'm a very focused person. When I get something where I'm good at keeping an eye on what is the main thing. The further up you go in leadership, the more easy it is to become a mile wide and an inch deep. Mm-hmm. And you can be over here dealing with this little problem all day long that in truth really has nothing to do with the long term of the business. And it's easy to get where people control your time instead of you controlling your time. And I think I'm a very focused person on what the main thing is. On the other side of that coin, Rick and I's relationship as co-CEOs, but I'm not an egomaniac. I'm willing to share power. I learned a long time ago, things are not about you. It's about the team. It's about your ability to get results. So I think those are some of my strengths. On the weakness side, it's pretty easy. Addison starts with ADD, okay? And where Rick may be too nice to say I'm probably the most disorganized person he's ever met, I'm sure it's probably true. While he's the most organized I've ever met, my life lives on sheets of notes. If you're one of these people out there that, is always going, hey, I had a great idea, I wrote it down, I can't remember where I put it. Okay, I'm your guy. Okay. I live in 15-minute bursts of energy where it's incredibly creative and I get things done, but then I bounce over here or whatever and stuff like that. So, one of the things Rick and I figured out is each of us together made the other better. And as I described many times to investors, we were kind of 1 and 1 equals 11. And, but yeah, there's no doubt that if you're looking for the guy to come help you organize your closet into appropriate color orders and stuff like that, I'd probably be the last guy you would want to bring in. When you were a kid in school, Darren, you remember, there was always the kid, which may have been you, by the way, that had their desk. It was so neat. The big books were on the bottom, the next size, the pencils were all in little pencil. And then there was a guy that all the paper was clunking out onto the floor or whatever and stuff from it. I was the one that all the paper was clunking out onto the floor.
Yeah. Well, no, it wasn't me either. I just got the lecture this past weekend that I was a little messy around the house. So I think my wife would also point that one out on me. So now, John, I know that like me, you believe that being a leader is not about having a title or being in a position ahead of others. I've heard you describe leadership as a disposition, not a position. So expand on that for us. What disposition does a successful leader need to have?
It goes back to, we were talking earlier about, in the early 90s when I was in a position that, I didn't have leadership over areas that needed to be done, but I stepped into the fray and stepped into a void. And see, I believe in my career, okay, I've learned over time, too many people talk about things they haven't done. One of my goals as I, go into this newest phase of my life is to make sure that what I'm talking about are things I've done so that I'm not sharing, theories, I'm sharing things that have existed in my life. And at every turn in my life, the greatest opportunities have usually come at the time of greatest adversity. I look back, the company, the first years I was there, was just amazing growth. Just almost like nothing could go wrong. And Art was an amazing force of nature running the company. And I was a mid-level manager in the company, doing well, doing so much better than I had done before I met the company and stuff. Darren, it might have been easy to have just rolled along with that. And now, been 30-something years in, a mid-level executive, done well and all that stuff. And it really was when there was a vacuum that it created the opportunity for me to shine and for me to step in. And one of the things that I've learned most is that you have to embrace adversity, not tolerate it, not survive it. You've got to embrace it. You've got to step in if you want to be a leader and be a change agent when a change agent is needed. Now that means you gotta, when I stepped into that role, I'm sure that I ruffled some feathers or whatever and stuff. I'm sure I did. But my way of doing things is to never be abrasive or loud or yell my way or the highway. My way is to try to be friendly and influence people. And so I believe that your disposition, your way you go about life, this is what worked for me, okay, is that I always tried to be somebody that even if you disagreed with John, you didn't go, and he's a jerk. Okay. I always wanted to be somebody that by the way I did things, how I talked to people, how I conducted myself, that people said he is a good guy. I may disagree with him, but he is a good guy and he is saying what he's saying for the right reasons, not for self-serving, me first reasons or whatever. So I would just, I've told people many times, I've spoken to, college groups and stuff, that I believe one of the greatest abilities is likability, where at the end of the day, if people like you and they respect you, that they'll listen to you. They may disagree with you, but they will at least listen to you. If they think you're an egocentric jerk, they're usually not even going to hear the words you say. So I believe your disposition, your approach to life, and your approach to people is critical to being a leader.
So then, aside from having the right disposition, John, describe other skills or assets that a person needs to have in order to be a great leader. If you were to give advice to somebody to say, all right, here's the path that I want you to grow into. So these are the skills and these are the character attributes that I want you to go to work on to be a great leader. What would those be?
I would say number one's hard work. Okay. I honestly believe, bosses may be able to put their feet on the desk and tell their team to sick them, or here's what you got to go do, which by the way doesn't work. But a leader means you're in front, that you're in front of the pack. You're not behind the team yelling at them from the rear. You're leading the team. So you got to have hard work. Number two, you got to be, in my opinion, a team player, that you're a part of the team. The team isn't, you, okay? That this entire mechanism below me is to make me look good and they're here for my gratification. You need to be a team player, not an egomaniac. You need to be somebody that the team comes first. Number three, you need to be consistent. I've seen leaders, I've worked for some where everybody is sitting around going, what kind of mood is he or she in today? Mm-hmm. Or when you saw them this morning, how were they? Okay. The team or the business doesn't need to move on whether you had a fight with your wife that morning. Okay. You need to have a consistency to you. And then you need to develop your communication skills. Now, I've always had the ability to think and put my thoughts into words as I'm speaking. I know for some people, public speaking doesn't come that. I'm not saying be a great public speaker. I'm not saying be a great stage presence. But you have to develop your communication and persuasion skills. I see so many young people, they've got earbuds in, they're tapping on their phone. They could walk in front of a train and never know, that they've been hit by anything or whatever. And I think we're losing the ability to communicate, not only to a group, but to one another. And I'm not talking about flowery words. I'm not talking about eloquent things. I'm talking about communicating, getting people to buy into your vision, to trust you, and the ability to persuade them to the direction and to the vision that you have for the organization. And that's not by sending out a fancy card that's got vision points or, our corporate creed or whatever on it. It is your ability to one-on-one and in a group persuade and move people's heart to your vision.
So, John, we talked about how, as co-CEO of Primerica, you saw the company through some pretty difficult times. And sometimes I think people are caught quite unaware by troubled times. I always said that nothing fails like success. You can start drinking your own champagne out of your trophy. So explain how we can avoid the success trap and what we could do to prepare ourselves while things might be sunny for the inevitable rainy days ahead.
There's a couple of things. One, that one thing that helped in an immense way, because, this sounds like, wow, John, boy, didn't you and Rick do something awesome? The reality is, one thing that made our job work was that Primerica is such a strong company, okay, that had been through, the trials of the early 90s after ART, that had been through our leadership and our sales force. This was not their first rodeo. They had been through great times and tough times, and that the company was founded on great concepts, a mission built on leadership in our sales force and our home office, and built on a rock. So number one, it helped that you were dealing with a business that was so fundamentally strong. But I think the thing that most prepared me was the sum total of those experiences, going through the good and the bad, seeing what worked, and more importantly, watching people where what they did didn't work. And in all honesty, Darren, the thing that prepared me the most is I knew my why. I knew that my job was to protect our leaders. I used to carry with me in my briefcase, as I was going back and forth to the battle, a book which shows all the pictures of the families of our $100,000 earners in our sales force. And I would look through it from time to time, and just to realize I'm fighting for families. I'm not fighting for a business. I'm not fighting for a profit and loss statement. I'm fighting for families. In the home office at Primerica, there are, hundreds of people that have been with the company over 30 years that were my friends. And I knew I was fighting for their lives. So I think the most important thing to prepare you for the trials is to make sure you know your why. When you're dealing with a tough issue, when you're dealing with a challenge, when you're dealing with a problem, always ask yourself, is what I'm doing for the right reasons? Is it for the team, or is it about me? Don't lie to yourself. The further up you go, I've learned that there's a kind of an inverse relationship, that the further you go up, the less contact you have mentally with who you are. You start to think, I'm such a big deal, all these kind of things, and you can always mentally justify your actions. I mean, unless they're just illegal or awful or whatever, but I mean, quite often life is so gray in things that it's easy to convince yourself you're doing one thing and you're really doing another. Always in the quiet moments, ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing. And then if you know you're doing the right thing, go wide open. Be a force of nature. Be somebody that, I always told people I'm always going to be moving forward. They're not going to shoot me in the back running. I'm going to be moving forward. And, but just always know what your why is.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Now, John, as the last question, the reason why I wanted to do this interview with you is because you've not only been a great leader through great times, and it's easy to be a leader when things are great and it's sunny and shining outside. It's like being the coach when you get a crop of really, really great players, right? It's easy to sort of keep the chicks in line, but to lead through tumultuous, difficult times is a real test of character and a real test of leadership, and you've done both. So as our parting thought for us today, give us a single thought, quote, or an idea that will help us weather every season as a leader, something we can look back on that will help us push forward through good times, bad times, and everything in between.
I think let me give first personal advice to the leader. You need to understand, you need to develop a peaceful core. You need to find the things in life that make you happy. Realize that you're in a fight where you can have success or failure, but that doesn't make you a good or bad person. It's it's what happened to you or happened to the business. Realize that you're a good person and develop a peaceful core where you, at 3:00 in the morning, feel good about you and what you're doing. than as it relates to your reaching out to others. I believe too often leaders, you know, Darren, you've heard the phrase divide and conquer, divide and conquer. I believe leaders need to unite and build. I believe one of the challenges in our country today is, and you know, as we seem so divided, we're divided by class, we're divided by race, we're divided by so many different things, that true leadership brings people of unlike characteristics together for a common purpose. You need to develop the ability to be a uniter. You need to understand that you're going to have to learn to love, get along with, and move forward with people who don't think like you, who don't look like you, who don't act like you. And if you expect people to all be like you, all you're going to do is make them mad and frustrate yourself. You need to be a uniter. You need to find the common purpose and common cause that drives people forward, and you have to be the flame that lights that cause and has the ability to reach across all lines and have people know that you're fair, you're focused, you're working hard, and you're going to help take them someplace that they couldn't go on their own. Leaders must unite.
Well, Mr. John Edison, it's been a true pleasure. As you know, I get a chance to see, study, and get to know lots of leaders. I've long admired you, your leadership, and the success story you and Rick have created. Thank you, John, so much for coming in and sharing your experience, your hard-earned insights with us here at Success.
Thank you, Darren. I feel the same about you and all the great work that you do, buddy.
Success Magazine Audio, copyright Success Media, all rights reserved.